The mud was up to your knees. It wasn't regular mud. It was mixed with blood, waste, and pieces of things you didn't want to identify. Your boots had rotted through weeks ago. Your feet were raw, swollen, infected. You hadn't slept in 3 days. The sound of artillery fire had become constant, a dull roar that never stopped, that made your ears ring even in the brief moments of silence. You were 16 years old. You'd lied about your age to enlist. They'd known you were lying, but they didn't care. They needed bodies. Warm bodies to fill the trenches, to march into gunfire, to die in fields thousands of miles from home. This wasn't the war the recruiting posters had promised. There was no glory here, no heroism, just mud and blood and the knowledge that you probably wouldn't live to see next month. And the worst part was knowing that even if you survived, even if you made it home, you'd never be able to explain what this was really like. The early months of 1716 saw England deep into yet another European conflict. War was constant in this era. Battles over territory, succession, trade routes, religion. The reasons changed, but the need for soldiers never did. Armies were massive, requiring tens of thousands of men. Most weren't professional soldiers. They were farmers, laborers, apprentices, boys, barely old enough to shave. Recruitment was aggressive. In towns and villages across the country, officers would set up tables and promise adventure, regular pay, and a chance to serve king and country. They painted war as noble, as a path to honor and respect. What they didn't mention was the disease, the starvation, the fact that you were more likely to die from dysentery than enemy fire. The conditions in military camps were worse than the poorest slums. Hundreds of men crammed into makeshift shelters with no sanitation, no clean water, no medical care worth mentioning. Disease spread fast. Typhus, smallpox, cholera. Men died in their sleep and weren't discovered until morning. The army didn't stop for funerals. Bodies were buried in mass graves and the regiment moved on. And once you enlisted, you couldn't leave. Desertion was punishable by death. You'd signed your life away and there was no getting it back. James Pritchard was 15 when he joined up. He came from a village in Kent, the youngest of 5 brothers. His family worked a small farm that barely produced enough to feed them. When the recruiters came through, promising steady wages and food, James saw a way out. His parents didn't want him to go. His mother cried. His father said nothing, just stared at the enlistment papers James had signed. But James was convinced this was his chance. He'd heard stories about soldiers returning home as heroes, about the respect they commanded, about the adventures they'd had. He imagined himself in a clean uniform, marching in formation, maybe even earning a promotion. He reported to the camp outside Dover 3 weeks later. The reality hit him immediately. There were no clean uniforms, just dirty, ill-fitting clothes that had been worn by previous soldiers, some of whom had died in them. There was no training to speak of. An officer showed them how to load a musket, how to stand in formation, and that was it. James had never fired a gun before. He was terrified of the noise, the recoil, the way the smoke burned his eyes. But fear didn't matter. Within 2 months, his regiment was shipped across the Channel to fight in Flanders. The conditions in the field were worse than anything James had imagined. They marched for days through rain and mud. There were no roads, just dirt paths that turned into rivers of sludge. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Those who couldn't keep up were left behind. Food was scarce. They were supposed to receive rations, but supplies rarely arrived on time. James went days eating nothing but stale bread and whatever they could forage. Water was even harder to find. They drank from streams and rivers, even though the water was often contaminated. Within a week, half the regiment was sick with dysentery. Men shit themselves where they stood because they couldn't make it to the latrines in time. The smell was overwhelming. When they finally reached the battlefield, James realized that the real enemy wasn't the opposing army. It was the environment. They dug trenches in the mud and waited. Hours turned into days. Days turned into weeks. The trenches filled with water. Men stood in it constantly, their feet submerged, their skin rotting. Trench foot set in fast. James watched men's toes turn black and fall off. He watched them scream as field surgeons amputated infected limbs with saws, no anesthesia, just a belt to bite down on. And through it all, the order was the same: hold the line, don't retreat, don't question, just stand there and wait for the order to advance. There was no camaraderie, no brotherhood forged in battle. That was a myth. Men kept to themselves. They didn't make friends because friends died, and grief was a distraction you couldn't afford. James tried talking to the soldier next to him once, a boy named Peter who was maybe a year older. Peter didn't respond. He just stared straight ahead, his eyes empty. 2 days later, Peter was hit by shrapnel during an artillery barrage. The metal tore through his chest and he died before he hit the ground. James didn't react. He couldn't. Reacting meant feeling, and feeling meant breaking down, and breaking down meant you wouldn't be able to do what came next. So he buried it. He buried all of it. The fear, the exhaustion, the horror of watching men die in ways that shouldn't be possible. He stopped thinking of himself as a person. He became a body, a tool, something that moved when ordered and stopped when told. At night, when the firing quieted and the only sound was men coughing and crying in the dark, James would lie in the mud and wonder if he'd ever feel anything again. He was 16 years old and he was already empty. If you'd been in James's place, knowing what war really was, would you have still enlisted? Would you have believed the promises of glory and honor, or would you have seen through the lies? And if you'd seen through them, if you'd known what waited in those trenches, would you have found the courage to refuse, knowing refusal meant poverty and shame? The battles themselves were chaos. There was no strategy at the level James experienced it. Just officers shouting orders and men stumbling forward through smoke and noise. Muskets were slow to load and inaccurate. You fired in the general direction of the enemy and hoped. Most of the time, you couldn't even see who you were shooting at. The smoke was too thick. James fired his musket dozens of times and never knew if he'd hit anyone. Artillery was worse. Cannonballs tore through lines of men, ripping bodies apart, leaving craters in the ground. Shrapnel flew in every direction. There was no cover, no protection. You just stood there and hoped the next blast wouldn't hit you. During one battle near Lille, a cannonball landed 5 feet from James. The explosion threw him backward. His ears rang so loudly he couldn't hear anything else. When he stood up, the 3 men who'd been standing next to him were gone. Not dead, gone. There was nothing left but pieces scattered across the mud. James stared at the spot where they'd been, and then an officer screamed at him to reload, and he did, because that's all there was. Reload, fire, reload, fire. Over and over until the order came to fall back or advance, and then you moved like a machine. No thoughts, no feelings, just movement. But here's what no one talks about. The part that makes everything worse. Most soldiers didn't die in battle. They died in camp. From disease, from infection, from starvation. For every man killed by enemy fire, 3 died from typhus or dysentery or infected wounds that turned gangrenous. And the officers knew this. They knew the conditions were killing their own men faster than the enemy ever could. But nothing changed. Supplies didn't improve. Medical care didn't get better. Because soldiers were replaceable. There were always more boys desperate enough or naive enough to enlist. The system didn't care if you lived or died. It just needed you to fill a spot in the line long enough for the next man to take your place. James figured this out after 6 months. He realized he wasn't a soldier. He was ammunition, a resource to be used up and discarded. And that knowledge, that understanding that his life meant nothing to the people giving orders, destroyed something inside him that never came back. Now think about the monuments, the statues of generals on horseback, the memorials listing glorious victories, the paintings of soldiers charging bravely into battle. Think about how war is remembered, as noble, as necessary, as something that built nations and defended freedom. Now set that against what James experienced, against the mud and the disease and the meaningless deaths. Which version is true? Which version do we choose to believe and why? Most soldiers didn't last more than a year. Disease, wounds, mental collapse. Something got you eventually. James made it 11 months. He'd survived 3 major battles and countless skirmishes. He'd watched hundreds of men die. He'd stopped counting after the first month. Then, during a march in early spring, he collapsed. Fever had been building for days, but he'd hidden it because showing weakness meant being left behind. When he finally went down, he couldn't get back up. His body had given out. Dysentery, typhus, malnutrition, all of it hitting at once. They left him at a field hospital, which was just a barn filled with dying men. There were no doctors, just a few orderlies who couldn't do anything but watch. James lay on a pile of straw, his body burning with fever, his mind barely conscious. He died 3 days later. He was 17 years old. His family was never notified. His name didn't appear on any casualty list. He was just another soldier who didn't come home. The regiment moved on. A new recruit took James's place in the line. The war continued. Battles were fought, territory changed hands, and thousands more men died in fields and trenches across Europe. And back home, the recruiting continued. Officers still set up tables in town squares, still promised glory and honor, still convinced boys that war was an adventure. The system fed itself. It consumed generation after generation, grinding them into the mud, and it never stopped. The nations that waged these wars became wealthy and powerful. They expanded their territories, secured their trade routes, built their empires. And they did it on the backs of boys like James, boys who believed the lies, who gave up their lives for promises that were never real. The comfort and security that citizens enjoyed, the stability of their governments, the growth of their economies, all of it was built on mass graves filled with forgotten soldiers whose names no one remembers. Even after this particular war ended, after the treaties were signed and the armies went home, the pattern repeated. New conflicts emerged, new reasons to fight. New generations of young men were fed into the machine, and the lies never changed. War was still painted as glorious. Soldiers were still called heroes. The monuments were still built. But the trenches remained. The disease remained. The truth remained, buried under layers of propaganda and selective memory. And in every war that followed, in every century, in every country, the same boys marched off believing the same lies and died the same meaningless deaths. The mechanisms of war evolved. The weapons became more efficient. But the fundamental truth never changed. War consumed the young and the desperate, and it always would, because societies needed soldiers, and soldiers needed to believe there was a reason, a purpose, something greater than themselves, even when there wasn't. Even when it was just mud and blood and the knowledge that they'd been lied to from the very beginning.